Hello, you're welcome to another exciting edition of this Bible study program. My name is Remark, and I'm a gospel preacher in the Church of Christ. Today I'm here again with my friend Patrick Donahue from Alabama, United States. Patrick, how are you doing today? You're looking good.
I'm great. Let's hope this headphone microphone combination works better than last time. I appreciate you doing these, Leslie. I've been reading a book about some preachers in Arkansas, and it would talk about how they really didn't start out trying to be debaters, but they believed that if they preached publicly, anything they preached publicly, they had to be willing to defend. So almost all these preachers had at least a few public debates because they thought, if I preach it publicly, I got to be willing to defend it. And it's too bad preachers don't feel like that today. I appreciate you being willing to defend what you believe and trying to propagate what you believe to be the truth, even if it runs contrary to other people's positions and doctrines.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate the encouragement all the time. Thank you so much. Yeah, today we want to talk about the law of Sabbath. Like, are we supposed to keep the Sabbath today? There are some churches, Seventh-day Adventists, and maybe some others, who believes that the Sabbath law is actually still binding. And that is why you see them worship on Saturday today, which is the seventh day. So we want to look at it and see if that law is still binding, and why is it that most Christians today and true Christians worship on Sunday while others go on a Saturday. So that's what we want to look at today. And I will start by asking you, are we actually, I know that Sabbath is one of the 10 commandments. Are we actually obligated to keep the Old Testament law today? Let's start with that.
So Hebrews 7:12 I think is a good passage to start with. It says, for the priesthood being changed, there's made a necessity, a change also of the law. So there's been a change of the law. This says, Leslie, when you change your oil in your car, you drain out, let's say, 4 dirty old quarts, and then you put in 4 new quarts. Leslie, do you ever put any of the old oil back in just to save a little money on the oil change?
Say that again.
You don't when you change the oil in your car, that means you completely replace the old oil.
You remove everything
with the new oil.
Right.
So when you change the oil, that means you completely replace the old with the new. So this says in Hebrews 7:12, there's been a change of the law. That means we would completely replace the old law with the new law. So it's an all or nothing argument here, Leslie. If any part of the Old Testament law has changed, then the whole thing has changed. We're under the New Testament law exclusively.
Okay. Yeah, you're correct. When you change something, when you change the oil in your car, you're removing and then replacing. So that applies to almost everything. When you talk about changing, you're removing and then replacing. So you're saying that Hebrews 7:12 says the priesthood was changed, and also that necessitated the change of the law. So that means that we are not under the Old Testament law, and we are not obligated to keep that law today. Okay, I have a couple of other questions, a lot of them for you that you're going to be responding to today. Do we have, in the Old Testament, people were actually obeying this law, they keep to this law. What actually brought about the change? Do we have any Old Testament passage or passages that talks about this change, predicting it?
Yeah, let me elaborate upon something in Hebrews 7:12, and I'll get to that question. I meant to mention this before. What the writer is doing there is he's saying, look, Jesus is our priest. Not only that, he's our high priest, but he couldn't be a priest if the law of Moses was still binding. Leslie, if the law of Moses was still binding, why couldn't Jesus be our priest today?
Because he's not from the tribe of Levite,
Exactly. That's the whole point the writer's making. Yeah. He had to be a tribe of Levi, descended from that brother of Joseph, to be a priest. Jesus wasn't. He's from, if you see from verse 14, he's from Judah. So he can't be a priest if the law of Moses is still binding. So the writer's saying, but he is the priest. Therefore, the priesthood must have changed. And then he says, well, if the priesthood changed, there's made a necessity to change also the law. In other words, you can't just change part of it. If you change part of it, you change the whole thing. Now, you asked me a question about the Old Testament predicting this change. Right. Well, Hebrews 8, verses 8 and 9 is a quote from Jeremiah 31, and 32. And here's Hebrews 8, verses 8 and 9. It says, For finding fault with them, he saith, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, with the house of Judah. Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continue not in my covenant, I regarded them not, saith the Lord. So here's what's going on there, Leslie. The original covenant, you read about that in Exodus 19. Basically, God covenant, a synonym for that would be agreement or contract. God makes an agreement with the Israelites. He says, if you will keep my law, then I'll be your God. You'll be my special people, my chosen nation. Okay, that's the agreement or covenant. Pretty simple. Jeremiah comes along hundreds of years later and says, hey, remember that covenant that God made with your ancestors when he brought them out of Egyptian slavery? One day in the future, there's going to be a new covenant, a new agreement. And Hebrews 8 is saying, basically, you remember Jeremiah saying, predicting or prophesying one day there's going to be a new covenant? Well, that's been fulfilled. We're in that new covenant. And Leslie, another synonym for covenant besides agreement, at least in the Bible, would be testament. As a matter of fact, if you read through the book of Hebrews, you'll see in the King James Version that Old Covenant, Old Testament are used interchangeably. New Testament, New Covenant are used interchangeably. That's because the covenant and testament come from the same Greek word, actually. So really, when he says we're under a new covenant, it's the same as saying we're under the New Testament, which means, of course, then that means that we're under the New Testament law today, the law of Christ. He's our leader, not the Old Testament law, sometimes called the law of Moses. Moses was their leader. Follow what I'm saying, Leslie?
Right. That was a good explanation, pointing to Jeremiah. They didn't keep the commandment, the covenant that God had with them. They broke the covenant, and so in Jeremiah 31, God said he's going to make a new covenant, and the Hebrew writer made reference to that. That this is going to be there's going to be a time that God will make a new covenant and all of that. But the next question now, which is also in connection to that, was there any time in the Bible that we find that this covenant was actually abolished? Do we find any scripture along that line?
Ephesians 2:15 says, talking about Jesus, I quote, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to make in himself of twain one new man, so making peace. So yes, Jesus in his flesh, I take it that means in his death, which we also see in Colossians 2:14. We'll look at that in a minute, hopefully, Lord willing. In his flesh, in his death, he abolished these commandments and these ordinances. When the law is abolished, Leslie, does that mean you still have to keep it, or you don't have to keep it anymore?
Yeah, once the law is abolished, you don't have any business with that again.
You don't have to keep it anymore. That's right. It's been abolished. And this is talking about the Old Testament law, and it uses the word abolished to refer to the Old Testament law.
Right.
You don't have to keep it anymore.
Right. So basically, the law has been abolished from what the scriptures clearly teach, and from that passage. Now, thank you for doing a background to the law, because this is crucial to understanding the law regarding Sabbath. Now, let's talk about the Sabbath specifically, because that is the main thing we want to talk about. Sometimes there are arguments made along that line. Maybe there are some laws that are ceremonial, some law of God and all of that. Does the Bible specifically say that we cannot obey the law of the Sabbath today? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Why are we not holding on to that?
Okay. Let me look at a couple of passages here in response to that question. Let's see. The first one deals with the 10 Commandments as a whole. And the second one will deal with the Sabbath specifically. The first one is Romans 7, verses 4 through 7. Let's look at that. It says, wherefore, my brethren, you also have become dead to the law by the body of Christ, that you should be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead, that we should bring forth fruit unto God. So there's verse 4. Now notice at the beginning of verse 4, Leslie, it says, we're dead to the law.
Yeah.
Now, Leslie, whatever law that's talking about, it says we're dead to it. Does that sound like we still have to keep it, or we don't have to keep it?
Yeah, we are dead to the law. We cannot be under it again. We
don't have to keep it anymore if we're dead to it, right?
Right.
And verse 5 and 6 says, for when we were in the flesh, the motions of sins, which are by the law, did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. But now we are delivered from the law, that being dead when we were held, that we should serve in newness of spirit, not in the oldness of the letter. So that says in the King James Version, Leslie, that we're delivered from the law. So whatever law that's talking about, Leslie, would that mean that we still have to keep it, or we don't have to keep it?
No, we don't have to keep it.
Yeah, if we're delivered from it, the newer translations will say released from it. And then verse 7, Leslie, tells us exactly what law he's talking about. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. They had not known sin, but by the law, or had not known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. Leslie, where did the law say thou shalt not covet?
Of course, in the Old Testament, we find it. Yeah.
10 Commandments. If I'm not mistaken, it's the 10th of the 10 Commandments. So guess what this is saying, Leslie? The law that we're dead to and delivered from includes the 10 Commandment law.
Right.
Which means we don't have to keep the 10 Commandment law anymore. Leslie, you know I'm on Sirius XM radio, national radio, but I've been on the radio, at least locally, since 1986, and this point comes up every now and then. And people say, Pat, that can't be true. Because if that were true, if we're not under the 10 Commandment law, that would mean we could kill, steal, and commit adultery today. Right. And I say, no. The reason it's wrong to kill, steal, and commit adultery today is not because the 10 Commandments said it was wrong. It's because the law of Christ
said so.
The New Testament says it's wrong to kill, steal, and commit adultery. Right. So the Israelites, it was wrong for them to kill, steal, and commit adultery because the 10 Commandments told them not to. It's wrong for us to kill, steal, and commit adultery because the law of Christ tells us not to. So when we say one law completely replaced the other, Hebrews 7:12, we admit there's some things that the laws have in common. Don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery. Both laws said that, but there's some differences. For example, the Old Testament law says, keep the Sabbath day holy. You can't work on Saturday. It says, do animal sacrifices. It says you have to circumcise your little boys at 8 days old. It says it's a sin to eat pork or catfish. Leslie, do you ever enjoy pork or catfish there in Nigeria?
Yeah.
It would be a sin to eat pork or catfish if we were still under the old law, but those laws are not in the New Testament.
Right.
So it's okay for us to work on Saturday. We can circumcise our little boys if we want to for health reasons, but it's not a sin not to. We can eat pork and catfish. We don't have to do animal sacrifices. And there's some New Testament laws that weren't in the Old. Leslie, can you think of anything major? Any major laws in the New Testament, Leslie, that weren't in the Old Testament?
That were in the Old Testament?
They're in the New Testament, but they're not in the Old. Can you think of anything major?
Okay. Like Lord's Supper, I know they observed Passover, but the Lord's Supper was instituted in the New Testament, which was not in the Old Testament.
That's a perfect example. In 1 Corinthians 11, it's talking about the Lord's Supper. Yeah. We eat a little piece of bread to remember his broken body, drink some juice, grape juice to remember his, it represents his blood. That's to remind us of the death of Christ, to help us to be thankful for it. 1 Corinthians 11 says, when you do this, you show or remember the Lord's death till he comes. Well, it wouldn't make sense to do that under the Old Testament. How could you remember his death? He hadn't died yet.
Right.
So that's the perfect example of something the New Testament tells us to do.
Right.
It's not in the Old. All right, one other thing. How about water baptism? Leslie, when you read through Genesis through Malachi, the Old Testament, do you ever see any reference to water baptism in the Old Testament?
No. We don't have water baptism. We don't have that.
Yeah. Who was the first one we can read about in the Bible to water baptize people?
I think that was John the Baptist in the Gospel.
Yeah, and you read about him in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So New Testament, water baptism, just like the Lord's Supper, is strictly a New Testament ordinances. So we're talking about one law completely replacing the other, Leslie. They have some things in common, but they have some differences, as you see. Now, you asked about the Sabbath specifically. Let's read Colossians 2:14 through 17.
Okay.
First, let's read verse 14. It says, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross. All right. So here we have some ordinances. This word ordinances in the English, Leslie, comes from our word ordain. Like if you have a city ordinance, that would be a law ordained by the city, like the mayor or the city council or something like that. Here we're talking about ordinances, laws ordained by God. And it says Jesus blotted them out, took them out of the way, and nailed them to the cross. Sound like we still have to keep those ordinances, Leslie, or we don't have to keep them anymore?
Yeah, we don't have to keep it anymore. Thank you. Thank you very much for.
If Jesus blotted them out, took them out of the way, and nailed them to the cross. And this not only tells us that they're not binding anymore. It tells us exactly when they stop being binding, Leslie. When do they stop being binding?
Okay, when? So when did it stop binding? I want you to throw more, shed some light on that.
Yeah. It's saying that they stopped being binding when Jesus died on the cross.
Okay.
He nailed to the cross. So that brings up an interesting question, Leslie. If the Old Testament stopped being binding when Jesus died on the cross, we know the Bible teaches that Jesus lived perfectly without sin. What law did he obey perfectly? What law was he responsible to?
That would be the law of Moses, the Old Testament law.
That's exactly right, because the Old Testament law was still binding till he died. He had to keep those old laws just like any other Jew. Matter of fact, his parents had him circumcised and everything. Now let me read verses 15 through 17, Colossians 2.
Okay.
And having spoiled principalities and powers, he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink, or in respect of a holy day, or of the new moon, or of the Sabbath days, which are shadow things to come, but the body is Christ. Look, in verse 16 here, he's mentioning 4 categories of Old Testament laws. He says, nobody can judge you with respect to meat or drink. That's the daily observances of the Jews, Leslie, the things they have to do every day. Respect of a holy day, we have a word here that's just exactly like that, holiday. So we have like January 1st, New Year's Day. How often does that occur, Leslie? New Year's Day, that holiday, how often does that come around?
It comes, you're asking how often it occurs? Every year, like?
Yeah, once a year. That's the way holidays work. They're once a year. Same way with the Jews. They had holy days, 7 yearly festivals or holy days, Passover, Pentecost, Feast of Tabernacles, so forth. And then, Leslie, I'm going to test your knowledge of astronomy. How often do we have a new moon? How often does a new moon physically occur? Once a month. It takes 1 month for the moon to go from full to dwindle down to empty.
Okay.
And to go back to full again. And it's going to be the same in Nigeria as it is in the United States. Okay. It's going to be 1 month.
Okay.
So we have the Sabbath is the 4th thing mentioned in verse 16. How often do we have a Sabbath?
The Sabbath, that's every week.
Every week. So you see, all 4 things are mentioned, Leslie. The meat or the drink is the daily observances of the Jews. The holy days here are the yearly things. The new moon is the monthly, and the Sabbath is the weekly. So it's giving you all 4 categories. It's saying nobody can judge you with respect to those things anymore because Jesus blotted them out, took them out of the way, and nailed them to the cross. Now, just to illustrate a difference here, Leslie, think back to Numbers 15. An Israelite got caught picking up sticks on the Sabbath. He was going to build a fire, I think, and it was the Sabbath law to build a fire on the Sabbath. What did God tell the Israelites to do to that man as penalty for picking up sticks on the Sabbath?
Now, you should be stoned to death. Should be stoned to death.
That's a pretty harsh judgment, isn't it, Leslie?
Right.
You're right. So, but now this verse is saying nobody can judge you with respect to the Sabbath anymore. Why? Because it's been blotted out, taken out of the way, and nailed to the cross. So in my career as a software engineer, I work mostly Monday through Friday. But if they needed me to work on Saturday, or if I wanted to cut my grass on Saturday, it was not a sin. But if I'd have done that back then, not only would it have been a sin, I would have been subject to stoning. But you see here, Romans 7 is saying that the 10 commandments are no longer binding. Colossians 2 here is saying the Sabbath specifically has been nailed to the cross, blotted out. It's no longer binding. And it's one of the 10 commandments. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It does answer my question. Thank you for that wonderful analysis. Now, you've been talking for quite some time, and you seem to say the law has been abolished. We are not under the law. It has been nailed to the cross, and we are not expected to, obey the Old Testament law. Now, is there any consequence? Suppose I choose to obey some of the laws. Okay, well, I want to obey this law of the Sabbath. I want to obey the tithes law. What consequence? Is there any consequence for that?
Okay. If you choose not to eat pork, for example, that's part of the old law. Or if you choose not to work on Saturday, the 7th day of the week, that's part of the old law. No sin in doing that. But if you try to say, for example, that law is still binding so that people are in sin if they eat pork, or people are in sin if they don't get circumcised, then there is trouble with that. Let me notice Galatians 5, 2 through 4. Here we had some people, evidently, and you can read the whole chapter of Acts 15 is about the same thing, Leslie, a debate on it, actually. You have some Jews, they're converted to Christ. Well, they had been circumcised as little boys.
Right.
Then you have Gentiles converted to Christ. And the Jews are saying, these Jewish converts, you Gentile converts, you got to be circumcised to be saved. It's how Acts 15, verse 2 puts it.
Right.
Paul is saying in Galatians 5, 2 through 4, oh, no, you don't have to be circumcised. That's part of the old law. Here's how it reads. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. For I testify again to every man that is circumcised that he is a debtor to do the whole law. Christ has become of no effect unto you. Whosoever of you are justified by the law,
you
are fallen from grace.
Right.
So he's saying, look, it's one thing, these guys were circumcised when they're 8 days old, and they're trying to get the Gentiles to be circumcised when they're 40 years old. That's a different matter, isn't it, Leslie? Ouch. He's saying, no, circumcision's part of the old law. You can't bind that on anybody. If you try to bind it, if you try to be justified by the old law, you're fallen from grace. That shows you how serious this is, Leslie. You can't fall from a tree, Leslie, unless you were in a tree. You can't fall from grace unless you were in grace at one time. These people who were trying to bind any part of the old law, he gives the example of circumcision, or the Seventh-day Adventists we have today that do the same thing. They're binding the Sabbath. It says they're trying to be justified by the law. They're fallen from grace. They were in grace, saved. They're out of grace now. They lose their salvation. That's how serious this is, Leslie. So it's not wrong to, Carol and I have 4 children, 3 of them are boys. We had the boys circumcised for health reasons. But if we go around trying to teach, you have to circumcise your little boys, or you can't be saved, or that's part of God's law today, we lose our salvation, Leslie. That's how serious it is.
Wow. So that means that's really serious, for people to actually bind the old law and say you have to obey this law. So those people keeping Sabbath and maybe paying tithes and picking some of those things in the old law and try to bind them today, they actually, the Bible says they lose their salvation, they're falling from grace. That's terrible. People need to be conscious of this. Okay, now, if we are not expected to keep the law of Sabbath, that is to worship God on a Saturday, which is the 7th day, when should we worship God today as Christians? What day is the day that God has chosen for Christians to worship him?
1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2 says, now concerning the collection for the saints, is I have given order to the church of Galatia, even so do ye upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. Leslie, anybody that's ever been to church knows what a collection is. I mean, that's what churches do. They have collections. Right. I'm not criticizing them because this passage commands us to have a collection. But Leslie, what day of the week does this passage command us to do the collection on?
The first day of the week.
First day of the week. Leslie, if the Old Testament law, the 10 commandments and the Sabbath were still binding, you would think that Paul would have commanded them to do the collection on the Sabbath, the 7th day of the week, right? The fact that he commanded on the first day of the week ought to clue us into the fact that we're not under that old law anymore. Now, Leslie, let me ask you another question. When you were growing up, when you disobeyed your parents, was that showing respect or disrespect to your parents?
Disrespect.
Okay, it's the same way with God. Remember, Jesus said, John 14, 15, if you love me, keep my commandments.
Right.
So if we love God and we respect God, of course we're saved by grace, but if we love him and respect him, we're going to try to carefully obey his law. For us, we're under the New Testament law. So if we're going to carefully obey this law, this instruction in 1 Corinthians 16 that we just read, Leslie, what day of the week are we going to do the collection on?
The first day of the week, which is on Sunday.
That's right. That's why the congregation I worship with here in Huntsville, Alabama, we do a collection every first day of the week because every week has a first day. But if we meet for midweek services on Wednesday or we have a revival Monday through Friday, we're not going to do a collection then. Why? Because it's not the first day of the week.
Right.
I mean, we're not claiming to be perfect, Leslie, but we're not going to disobey God on purpose. So if he says do the collection on the first day of the week, we're not going to argue about it. We're going to do the collection on the first day of the week. But notice, it's not the Sabbath. You see, Christians worship on the first day of the week, not the Sabbath. Another passage is Acts 20, verse 7, that mentions the first day of the week, Leslie. It says that upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow and continued speech until midnight. What day of the week is this talking about, Leslie?
It's so clear, the first day of the week.
First day of the week. They came together to break bread, and then Paul preached to them. What's that talking about, breaking the bread there, Leslie?
Yeah, I believe that's in reference to the Lord's Supper. That's the communion which we mentioned earlier that they did, you know.
That's exactly right. 1 Corinthians 10:16 says, the bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? So this is talking about the communion. The disciples came together the first day of the week to break bread, to have the communion, and have preaching. That's obviously a worship service to me. So what day of the week, if we're going to, if you love and respect God, you're going to try to carefully obey his law for you. If you're going to try to carefully follow this example in Acts 20, verse 7, Leslie, what day of the week are we going to come together to do the Lord's Supper on?
Of course, on Sunday, first day of the week.
Yeah, not Saturday the 7th. And then you think about this, if you're going to carefully obey this example, follow this example, how often are you going to do the Lord's Supper, Leslie?
Well, if you look at it, it should be every first day of the week, as regularly as it comes. That's the idea, because we only have
every week.
Every week, yes.
Every week has the first day in it. You do it every week. But a lot of churches, as you know, Leslie, just do it once a month or once every 3 months. I just don't think they're carefully following this passage. They're not following it as carefully as they ought to, Leslie.
So basically, you're saying that the Christians are expected to gather on a Sunday to observe the Lord's Supper and then to make collection as have been directed by the Bible. So that means that Saturday is not a day of worship for Christians, and those who are keeping Sabbath or Saturday as a day of worship, they're actually making a mistake. I hope that people would actually consider these arguments. I have one last question for you. Is there anything in the Old Testament that is still binding today? I know you talked about it from the beginning, that the law has been abolished and everything. But could you just imagine? I know people bring in instrumental music sometimes, tithing and a lot of other things like that. Do you think there are still some things in the Old Testament that is likely to be binding today, which is not said in the New Testament?
Let's remember the point, Leslie, that was made from Hebrews 7:12 and also Galatians 5:3. It's really the same point. Hebrews 7:12. The priesthood changed, that means the whole thing's changed. In other words, it's all or nothing. In Galatians 5:3, he says, for I testify again, every man that is circumcised, he's a debtor to do the whole law. In other words, if you try to bind circumcision or any other one thing, no matter what it is, to be consistent, you're going to have to bind the whole thing. You're going to have to keep the whole law. Well, he's not trying to tell us to keep the whole thing. What he's trying to say is that none of it is binding. None of it is binding. So both Hebrews 7:12 and Galatians 5:3 are clearly and emphatically teaching that nothing, not one solitary law in the Old Testament is still binding today, that we're under the New Testament law exclusively. Now, we know all kinds of denominational people that will try to pick out 3 or 4 or 5 things from the Old Testament law and say, well, I think that's still binding today. It depends on which denomination you're talking to, which one they try to bind. And unfortunately, we have gospel preachers that do the same thing. They'll say, well, these Old Testament law is not binding, but this, and this is still binding today. When they do that, they're doing exactly what Galatians 5:3-4 warns against. They're trying to bind one thing. To be consistent, they would have to bind the whole thing. Paul's point is that none of it's binding. We're under the New Testament law exclusively. And if you pick out even one thing in the Old Testament, say it's still binding, you are fallen from grace. You lose your salvation.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think you've actually done justice to the subject. That's my friend and brother, Patrick Donahue from Huntsville, Alabama. His website is www.bibledebates.info. You can actually go there. It's got a lot of resources there. It's debates, and, you can actually visit and see for yourself. Before we end the session, do you have any closing remark that you would like to tell us?
Well, if you don't mind, I would like to go over a couple of passages in Galatians 3 that we skipped over that are on my notes. Galatians 3:19 says, wherefore then serveth the law? I think the New King James says, what's the purpose of the law? That would be a great passage to talk about in a study like this. Why do you have the law? What's the purpose? It says it was added because of transgressions till the seed should come to whom the promise is made, and it was ordained by the angels in the hand of a mediator. So the law was added till the seed should come. Now, who's the seed in this context, Leslie?
That's Jesus Christ.
Yeah. the end of verse 16 says, "Into thy seed, which is Christ." So,
Yeah.
so the law was added in the days of Moses. It was enforced for many centuries, but this says it was added till the seed, Christ, should come. Well, Leslie, did Christ come?
Of course, he did.
Yeah. So if the law was added till the seed should come, let's say we're going to study till 3:45 American USA time.
Yeah.
That means we're going to stop at 45. If the law was added till the seed should come, that means the law is going to stop being binding when the seed comes, when Christ comes. So this really confirms what we read in Colossians 2, that this law was nailed to the cross. When Christ came and then he died, that was the end of the binding nature of the law. And then another passage of Galatians 3:24 and 25 says, "Wherefore the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ,
Yeah.
that we might be justified by faith. But after that faith has come, we're no longer under a schoolmaster." So Leslie, what is verse 25 says we're no longer under the schoolmaster.
Yeah.
But what does verse 24 identify as the schoolmaster in this context?
Yeah, the law was our schoolmaster. That was the law, basically.
That's right.
Yeah.
The law is our schoolmaster, according to verse 24.
Yeah.
25 says we're no longer under the schoolmaster.
Under the law, which is the schoolmaster.
So that means we're no longer under the law. If we're no longer under the law, does that sound like we still have to keep it, Leslie, or we don't have to keep it?
So the bottom line, long story short, we don't have to keep the old law today.
Right.
The Old Testament is gone. You know, the time, the era of the law is past, and Christ has nailed it to the cross. He has taken it out of the way. That's a good one. I hope that people would learn, and those who have been confused or deceived that they can continue to worship God on the Sabbath day and be pleasing to him, they need to realize that the book of Galatians 5 verse 4 says that they have actually fallen from grace and have been severed from Christ. Thank you very much, and that will be all for now. I hope to have you back here again to discuss again. Okay, you want to say something?
Yeah, one more thing.
All right.
Somebody's within reasonable driving distance of Alabama.
Okay.
Because I believe what I taught today can be successfully defended from the scriptures, I'm willing to discuss it publicly.
Okay.
And I know people, most of the time they'll turn you down. I'm convinced because they, even though they believe something, they don't believe it can be successfully defended from scripture. Because if they did, they would be more than happy to debate it publicly. I'm willing to debate this publicly. I believe I can prove this from the scriptures, that the Sabbath, the 10 Commandments, that the Old Testament law is no longer binding, that we're under the New Testament law exclusively. I believe it so strongly that I believe I can defend it publicly, successfully in religious debate. If anybody's interested, just, you can get a hold of me through Leslie. He'll tell you how to get a hold of me, okay? He already mentioned my website, BibleDebates.info. You can get a hold of me that way too. Thank you for doing this, Leslie. It's such a good work you're doing.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. God bless you.